Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Roth, and I am the director at the Ryerson Image Center in Toronto. On behalf of the RIC, I would like to thank all of you for joining us tonight for our Tanenbaum lecture, co-presented this time with the Stephen Bulger Gallery. And tonight we will be speaking with the influential and, if you pardon my editorializing, the wonderful American photographer, Wendy Ewald. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that while our program is virtual, we are broadcasting from Ryerson University, which is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The university has recently acknowledged its own role in Canada's residential school system's history, and we have committed to a number of actions, including the decision to change the institution's name in the coming months. This to redress that legacy in furtherance of truth and reconciliation. While the Tanenbaum Lecture Series has had several names, from 1986 to 2013, it was actually sponsored by Kodak Canada, and it was known as the Kodak Lecture Series. Through the years, over 230 photographers, filmmakers, media artists, photo historians, and curators came to Ryerson to address Toronto audiences, including the very first speaker, W. Eugene Smith, and an extraordinary variety of practitioners since then, such as Berenice Abbott, Dawood Bey, Stan Brakhage, Susan Meisalas, Eli Reed, Jamel Shabazz, and Michael Snow, among many, many others. The continuation of this great series was made possible by a generous gift from Howard and Carol Tanenbaum in 2014. And I want to take this opportunity to offer a great thanks to the Tanenbaums for their ongoing generous support for this lecture series and for other programs at the RIC. I'd like to mention a few program notes before we begin tonight. We are recording tonight's event, and we will be uploading it onto our YouTube channel in the near future for those who are not able to attend tonight or for those who want to watch it again. After the lecture tonight, Wendy will be taking questions. If you have anything that you'd like to ask during the lecture, please use the Q&A function in your Zoom window, located at the bottom of the window, to submit them. And lastly, in the case of a technical difficulty, we thank you for your patience with us as we try to fix the issue. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Wendy Ewald. Wendy is an American photographer, educator, and author who for over 50 years has collaborated in art projects with children, families, women, and teachers around the world in communities including India, Holland, South Africa, Mexico, Tanzania, and Morocco. Her projects examine questions of identity and cultural difference, among other subjects. But Wendy is probably best known for her work with children, whom she teaches to use cameras and to write in innovative and culturally specific ways, to record their families, their communities, and themselves, making artworks that describe their lives and evoke their fantasies and dreams. Wendy has received many honors, including a prestigious MacArthur Fellowship, a Guggenheim, and grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Andy Warhol Foundation, the Rauschenberg Foundation, and the Fulbright Commission. She has had solo exhibitions at innumerable museums, including the International Center of Photography in New York, the Photo Museum in Winterthur, Switzerland, the Queen's Museum in New York, and many others. The occasion for this presentation is her most recent exhibition, which is at the Stephen Bulger Gallery here in Toronto, called The Pictures Woke the People Up: Canada, Colombia, and American Alphabets. This show runs from November 20th until January 15th. And I want to take this moment to thank Stephen and his wonderful team at the gallery for bringing Wendy and her work to Toronto, and for inviting us at the RIC to partner on presenting this talk to our audience tonight. I also want to share briefly my own history with Wendy, because it's been a long but occasional relationship that we've had. Wendy's exhibition, Secret Games, which was organized by the Addison Gallery of American Art in the United States, traveled to many venues. And many years ago, in 2002, I worked at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., when the show came to us. And it was a fantastic show and a revelation about different ways of working with photography, ways beyond anything that I had ever seen or experienced before. And I fell in love with her work from that moment. But I also want to share an anecdote that was great for me to experience at the time, and even better in memory, which is that when we hosted the exhibition in Washington, D.C., and for those of you who don't know, the Corcoran was right across from the White House in the old executive office building. We received a phone call from the Secret Service the day before the exhibition opened, and we were told that Laura Bush, the First Lady of the United States, wife of George W. Bush, wanted to come to see the exhibition right then. And we were completely shocked by this. The Secret Service came across the street with bomb-sniffing dogs, swept the building, went through the galleries. And right after that, Laura Bush came with two of her friends. And we learned that one of the friends, both of them were educators, and one of them had heard about the show and wanted to see it and told Laura Bush about it. And just on a dime, they decided to come over. And I was the only person available to show the exhibition. And I was dressed poorly, let's say. I think I was wearing shorts and a t-shirt. And so I walked Laura Bush and her two friends through the gallery and had the amazing experience of watching the First Lady of the United States and a former librarian, a former school librarian, talking to two educators about Wendy's work and about children and how they express themselves. And it was extraordinary. They were very free with each other. And it was not at all the reaction that I would have expected from such a ceremonial visit. It was one of my great Washington experiences, and something that I love remembering every time I think about Wendy and her work. With that, I want to turn things over to Wendy so she can talk to you about her exhibition at Stephen's Gallery and her career. And just a reminder, after she is done talking, I will come back on screen and we will start the Q&A. Thanks, Wendy, for being here.
Great, thank you. So one thing that happened after Laura came is she decided that she wanted to attend a workshop I was giving, and I gave a lot of workshops in those days, and so we had to go through the whole Secret Service experience of we had to get past, and then Laura had to had to decide when she could come, and etc. And in the end, she didn't come. But it was very interesting to know that she wanted to learn how to do what we were doing. But anyway, this is this show that I'm sitting in the middle of here, the pictures that woke the people up. The title is from a phrase that a woman in Labrador, an elder, one of the very respected women, said when she began to see pictures that we found and brought back, both my pictures, anyway, I will get into that, and so I just want to sort of ground that in the understanding that they had of seeing pictures from the past, how it woke the people up. Anyway, so we can go to the next slide. And so I went, when I was 18, I graduated from high school, and that summer I went to Labrador, and then for the rest of my college education, every summer I went and worked in New Brunswick in native reserves, both in Labrador and New Brunswick. Okay, we can go on. And so that summer I worked, I brought Polaroid cameras and film, and that I got from the Polaroid Foundation, and that was something that people were doing then, just starting to do, really. And I realized I was photographing, but I realized that I could not do what they could do, and it was also natural for me to think about the connection between myself and the people I was making pictures of, and reflect on how that encounter affected both of us. And I really wanted to make photographs that were more immediate and revealing and different from traditional portraiture that called for a formal distance between myself and the subject. But overall, looking at my career, I realized that with time, I learned to back off and let the world reveal itself to me. And you know, with each project, I understood new things about this connection between me and the people I was working with. And so and also in response to this, I tried to shift the, you know, the focus, the materials I was using, and let the community or the people I was working with lead me, and which continued to make the experience very exciting. And I was always worried that somehow this wouldn't work this time, and I certainly had to wait and look, and then finally I'd get a sign, and then keep working and reevaluating what I was seeing and what I was doing. But it's a very difficult way to work, but very, very revealing. So I became more conscious of the method that I was using, although it did change all the time. And I was able to experiment with ways of sharing control over the image making because of that. And so photography as the discipline I was schooled in became quite predictable and stylistically uninteresting after a while. But the medium continued to fascinate me because one had to be there in order to make the photographs. And the dialogue between the photographer and the subject, and inevitably the viewer, that is what really interested me. And beyond aesthetic choices, I came to see photography as a language to which everybody has access. So that I learned that quickly, when I was 18. And also this was a time when there was very little known about Native Americans, or very little photography. And most of it was very romantic. So we can go on. And in addition to working with the kids in the community where I was living in Labrador, and handing them Polaroid cameras, and we would do walks and do different projects, I also started using words. And this is one of the young people in New Brunswick who was explaining his life from the beginning. I was born on the reservation. My mother left me there with my grandfather. He gave me away to old Basil Joe because he said, "We don't want another bastard in this house." My mother went to Maine and Boston. I didn't know her until I was 5. And many of these stories were very harsh at that time. I never really used them for anything at the time, but now, 50 some years later, I'm beginning to look at this work again. Okay. So this is a photograph, a portrait taken by Patrick Rich in Labrador. And he was a great portrait photographer. I mean, he's still alive now, and I am still involved with the community, which I'll show you later. Go ahead. This is another picture of his grandmother. So we would take, the children were some of them were photographing on their own, as with Patrick. He was in his own house. And then he would bring back the pictures, and we would talk about them. Okay. And this is my sisters are shy, which was another one of his pictures. Okay. And this is a photograph by Benedict Michel of his sister and two sisters and brother, I think. And Benedict was 14, 15 at the time, and I hung out with him and some other young teenagers that summer. I was 18, so we communicated very well. And Benedict ended up becoming one of the most important leaders in the Innu Nation in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. One of the first projects he did was to make a photo story about what he wanted changed on the reserve. Okay. And so you could see here, this was my first publication. And he says, I like to take pictures because it is fun to take or keep for a long time. It also can let you remember where, who, and what it is like. I took these pictures because I know what I feel about them, and I feel so bad. Most of the people who work at the sawmill are not paid as the people over across the river, which means the white people. Some people have to walk all the way down the hill just to get some water. The pump houses they made are not good, etc. So that's the school in the upper left, and then you can see the one of the girls going to fetch water from the pump house. So that was the first thing I did, and it was over a long period of time, but it's not something that I had really ever done anything with. And then I graduated from college, and I got a Fulbright fellowship and went to Colombia, and worked and lived there for really about 3 years. Okay. So again, I worked in a village, and also photographed there in the mountains. My students, a lot of my students were really workers. They took care of the livestock. They all had jobs. So this was their last, they were in 5th grade. This was probably the last time that they would go to school at that point for some of them. But I also began to ask them to make, and I did this earlier, but to put titles on the pictures, because that way they could direct the audience, the viewer, towards what they wanted to see. So this obviously changes it. If you know, it's a friend holding her little brother, his little brother, by Alirio Casas. And you begin to understand the relationship between the photographer and the subject. Okay. One of the things that I ended up doing quite a bit is asking kids to photograph their dreams or fantasies. I came to understand that so much of childhood, watching the kids photograph and play, and had to do with play. And I wondered how to create a kind of process in which they could access that for their photographs. And I started using the idea of dreams, so that we would tell our dreams to each other, and then they would figure out what dreams they wanted to photograph, go home and make the pictures. And so this is by Luis Arturo Gonzalez, and what he's doing is he has a bread bag. They would go to the market and get the bread, and so he used the bread bag to put over, to ask his subject to put over his face in order to make this sleepyhead character. But then on the other hand, there's all this road going up into the mountains, which adds so much to the photograph. Uriel Saddling the Burro by Fanny Valero. So I lived there for a year and a half in the village, and then towards the end of my time there, I met a woman in Bogota, a single mother of three boys. Can you, yeah. And I became really interested in her story. Well, she wanted to tell me her story because she'd seen some work that I had done with the people in the village in Rakita. And she said, well, can I tell you my story? And at first I just gave her a tape recorder and said, sure, well, you know, tell your own story. Here's a tape recorder. And then it became clear that she wasn't going to do that without me. And so I then switched and started working in Bogota. And these are two of the girls in the invasion barrio where Alicia lived. You can see how determined they both were to make the best picture they could. And this ended up being a book after like 2.5 years called Magic Eyes. And you can actually, well, later when we're talking, you can see it's behind me here, bits of it. And what I did is I combined the story, Alicia's story of her life that we ended up tape recording for, you know, for maybe about a year on and off, and we'd get together at night and when her kids were asleep, and she would tell me her story, and it was clear that she was a great storyteller. So I thought to bring novels to her to give her an idea of, you know, how she might maybe make her descriptions more vivid or whatever. And the first one I gave her was In Search of the Absolute by Balzac, because I had a Spanish version that was in the house I was living in. And within 3 days, she had read it. And she had told the story to her children and explained to me that this was not a novel that she was reading, that this was not fiction. This was so true to the emotional life of the characters that to her it was nonfiction, which was fascinating to me. The more that I understood about this story, the more I thought that, you know, you can't just have pictures by themselves in this case. And I wanted to combine the photographs with that the kids had taken and that I was taking also of Alicia and somewhat of Alicia, but she didn't really want to be photographed or filmed. So we began to, I began to use other people to represent her and her family. So can you go on? So this is Alicia with her son. But then, you know, she didn't want to be known. And so, you know, I used a mother and her son. And also at this time, I was shooting with the Hasselblad and the kids were shooting with Instamatic. So it was the same format. So I could actually use both of them in the creation of the book and in sort of visually equal way. Okay. So then when I made the book, it took me a long time to figure out how to work the visual and the story. And I work with a wonderful designer, Katie Homans, who designed this. And she came up with this idea of creating these two equal, the text being equally the same size and square format, and then which meant putting those black squares as paragraph breaks. Okay. So I'm going rapidly through this, but these are all projects that are in the show at Stephen Bulger. And so there's one room in the front that is a series of American alphabets. And my husband and I adopted a baby from Colombia, and so we were very, concerned about language and how people saw him, and I was also working in schools in North Carolina, and there are a lot of immigrants from Latin America in North Carolina with the tobacco harvest. And so I had the idea that it would be good to create teaching materials for Spanish-speaking kids, or with Spanish-speaking kids, for their white counterpart, their Anglo counterparts in schools. So I worked with an English as a second language teacher to create this first one. Can you move? Okay, so the first one is Spanish, and that I did, and it was with the kids. We made an installation in the school so they could share their language with their classmates, which they were really happy to do because they felt very stigmatized anytime they would speak in Spanish, and so they wanted to share it. And so we worked with the dictionary, and to try and recreate the form of a dictionary. And so one of the words they chose was impostor, and then one of the kids wrote for the definition, someone who robs and treats people badly and kills people. And then the use of it in a sentence, there's an impostor trying to rob all the money from the bank. So each one of them took a different letter and came up with the word. And then we worked together to come up with the photographic concept for the word. And then I shot it with a 4x5. And then they took the negative and wrote with magic marker or scratch with etching tools to create the letter and the word. And so this is nervioso. And I started understanding that these words were not normal words that you would see in an alphabet. I mean, it's not that I wanted to try and blow up this idea of what words had been used in alphabets, and hopefully that they would be culturally specific. But I guess I didn't realize how directly culturally specific they would become. Querer, when you love someone. Okay. And then there were other things that were, just pieces of everyday life, like grapes. And then they also played with the scratching and with the etching tool where the black areas were. And they would bring the things in from home, to shoot. And then I was commissioned to make a piece for the Cleveland Center for Contemporary Art. And at this point, I understood that I really wanted to try other alphabets and see what happened and play with them differently. And I also was very interested in mnemonics and the idea that that there were separate words and separate ways of communicating that weren't sanctioned in schools. And so the African American alphabet was in a school that was one of the first you know, it was a historical school where Stokely Carmichael and other activists had grown up. So this is the first one, A for African American, B for brother. And it was also the first time that I had shot in color. And I thought that I didn't want to do it in black and white because I thought that was, you know, it was too obvious a way to do it. And so I was so nervous about shooting in color that I shot it all in color and all in black and white, and then decided to combine it. But it was the beginning of working in color. The boy is always talking trash. So they did all that. It was their ideas, you know, to do this. It was his idea to do the X. And also his idea to do the X's on the side. And then I always had different backdrops that I thought were, you know, culturally appropriate or asked people about. So the kids could decide which backdrop that they wanted. So one of the last ones I did, I also did the Arabic alphabet, but that's not being shown here. I worked in the school where I had gone to high school and worked with white girls. And that was very revealing because, like this one is insecure, being unsure of who you are, how you fit in. That it was the girls afterwards, after looking at the words they had chosen, were very surprised at how sad it seemed. Also, as part of this project, we decided that they, or I decided that they could make a decision about if we were to sell any of these, where would the money go? And so they decided they looked into a program for giving books to girls schools in Pakistan. So it had many layers to it. Okay. And this is sort of my favorite one, Normal. And with the idea of her, you know, thinking that she was typically describing something that is usual or conforms to the standard. So it really bounced it off of the other alphabet projects I'd done. And I found it a very useful way to break down documentary photography into bits and pieces when teaching. So I've used it a lot. Yeah, victim, as I said, someone who has suffered as a result of an action or belief. And it was really fun doing these with everybody because, you know, it involved a lot of acting, and the arm coming in was my assistant, who also often has to stand in. And I think, you know, they were moved by the emotions that came out, as I was too. Finally, zonked. This is actually Yo-Yo Ma's daughter. Yeah. So it was a good way to end the white girls. So what is really interesting now to me, you know, now that I'm an older person looking back at all these things, is thinking about wanting to see what's happened. And in Labrador, you know, which I, you know, went to when I was 18, I had heard about that there's many challenges and difficulties in this community. And actually, at first, I hadn't heard, I hadn't kept in touch, or they hadn't kept in touch. and then there was an article in the New York Times about this community that I'd worked in, who'd asked the government to take their kids away because they were so much drug and alcohol abuse and also suicide. So it was a very poor time. And I didn't really connect it all together, but then I was asked to go back. The people in the community and people who worked in the community thought it might be helpful if I came back and brought the pictures from 39 years earlier, although I had left them there, but they had, not been kept. And I said, well, okay, I'll go, but I have to do a new project. I don't want to just go there and not, be able to do something new with them. Okay. Yeah, here's the article that was in the Times, and it was a very difficult article. So I also continued to work with people, with teenagers there, and mostly three people, and they worked with me and also I brought with me Eric Gottesman, who was one of my students, and we worked with Zach and Dakota and Philip for really about 2 years on and off, or maybe even 3 years, and then we had an exhibition at the Interpretation Center in Labrador. Okay, you can move on. And as part of that exhibition, we asked people to bring their photographs so that we could start collecting pictures of the Innu, both that they had taken, but also that other people had taken, to start creating. Well, they had an archive, but this is was continuing to create it and make a digital archive so that they could share it more easily with other people. And so during the exhibition, people brought their pictures in. So then they, were actually curating the kids that I worked with, as well as taking the pictures. Now, these are the result of that collection, and this is called the Innu Online Picture Archive. But it's a Facebook page that people were contributing to, and these are the conversations underneath the pictures that people had in response to the photographs. And that is also included their scrolls here in an exhibition. But this was an exhibition in the Addison Gallery in Massachusetts. So it was the first time that we had done that. And then also we made banners of some of the pictures taken in 1969 and some of the pictures taken later in 2007 on. And we asked people, I think you can go on, maybe, yeah. We asked people to vote on which pictures they saw in the exhibition they thought should be made into banners, and also where they thought that they should be placed. And so eventually we were able to make them into banners in the community and in the White Air Force Base that was nearby, or that had been. It was a US Air Force Base in '69, and now it was a German base. Here you can see, this is in the old school, where they were just building a new school, and So one of them says, if you put the ice in the water, it won't last very long. And then they walked here, but no more is on the left. So they worked with the kids, worked with their parents and grandparents to come up with a text to put on the images. And so they were inside, some were inside, some were one was on the water tower. And some of these are still there, 10 years later. It's amazing how long these things last. But it was really, as you can see, there's this one that was shown outside the Addison Gallery in Massachusetts. And now it's being shown here in Toronto. Another copy has just been made for Toronto. And I will end with that. So this is in Parliament and King East Street. It's up there now. So if you're in Toronto, please go see it.
Wonderful. That's fantastic. Thank you, Wendy. I really encourage everyone to see the exhibition at Stephen Bulger Gallery. I saw it earlier today, and it's a wonderful look at 3 projects. Though one of them, of course, the alphabet is actually represented by multiple projects because you've used that format multiple times in your career.
And this is the African American alphabet here behind me, and then this is Colombia on the left.
Yeah. And out of the frame, but to your left, to my right, I was happy to see, I think, the same prints that I saw back when Secret Games was in Washington. And there are a number of prints from that show, your mid-career survey. For those of you who are just learning about Wendy's work, I encourage you to dig deeper into it, either through this exhibition or through her many books, because you'll see a kind of photography that radically reformatted how we think about documentary practice and photography. Wendy was one of a number of people in North America who was working to reinvent documentary practice so that it was not that typical format of a photographer coming to a place and taking away images that are made privately and that will be published somewhere else. Instead, she made images that were produced by collaboration, by the people who were within communities, expressing communities. And of course, that's more normal now. But one of the reasons why that's more normal is because of the kind of work that Wendy has done over many years. So when we now think critically about who pictures are for and where they appear and how they are published or reproduced or exhibited, Wendy was thinking about those issues in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when other people were still looking at the kinds of images that we thought of as documentary in the 40s and 50s, a certain kind of newspaper photojournalism. So, and there are many other reasons to think about her work, of course, but I wanted to zero in on some aspects of your work that have always interested me. And one of them and this is one I'd really like to start with, is about this practice that you've developed more recently of returning to communities. Of course, you just talked about one example of that. And this book, Portraits and Dreams, called the second edition, but really it's like a totally different book than the first one that you did in the mid-1980s, which is a classic. This includes the original pictures that you made in Kentucky with Apple Shop, a great organization. And it also includes revisiting that community. And one of the things you say in this book that I find fascinating is you talk about how, and I think you do this late in the book, you talk about how wonderful it's been for you to find out about the later lives of the people that you work with when they were quite young, because oftentimes these are people who have their own families, and kids that are even older than they were when you worked with them.
Yeah.
And So for example, one of your students who you in Labrador, um, who you actually mentioned here, Benedict Michel,
Yeah.
became the president, the political leader of the Innu Nation. Later,
Mhm.
tragically died in his mid-50s. Um, and I know that as you've gone back to different communities and reconnected, and sometimes even before you go back, you'll reconnect through correspondence with people that you worked with when they were young. I assume, or I hope, that some of them have expressed to you what being in one of your workshops or your classes has meant for them, how it's continued to impact their lives. And I wonder what it is that you're told. What are some of the things that you've heard from them?
Well, I mean, especially, I mean, I spent like quite a few years actually with them, with the kids in Kentucky who are now in their 50s. And one of the things that they talk about is they never had any sort of schooling in that way. Not, I don't mean in photography, but any sort of critical thinking. And also understanding who they were and seeing the rest of the world. And you know, in Kentucky, we had some exhibitions in New York at the ICP and in Chicago. So those were huge experiences. So I think for some of them, they were really important. But I think what I really wanted that to happen is then just not that they become photographers, but that they think about the world around them. They have self-confidence, because in many places they're somewhat cut off. They were somewhat cut off, like in Kentucky was very rural at that point. You know, they didn't have any media or anything like that. Yeah, I think there's amazing things that I sort of hear about from time to time.
And some of them have continued to make photographs.
Yes, yes, yes.
Um, Another thing that, and I've already mentioned, you know, with this book, and I talked as well about Secret Games, which is a fantastic catalog published by Scalo of the Addison Gallery show. You've made many books in your career, and in fact, books are and have been central to your practice in every sense. For example, with your classes and your workshops, often you produce many books, each student producing their own in various ways, from the handmade analog era to now, when I assume that it's done quite differently. And of course, you published many books. You published a how-to book, a children's book, and of course, you published books dedicated to specific projects. You showed an image of Magic Eyes, which is a great book about the Columbia project. I wondered if you can talk a little bit about publishing and why that's so important for you. And is it in most cases, in all cases, the ultimate expression of each collaboration that you do with students, with families, with women in different communities? And if so, why?
Well, I think I'm really fascinated with books and what you can do in a book, and the sequencing and presentation, and also I'm able to use text, not because I think that the way that people talk is as interesting as how they photograph, and that it's their own way of using words or their own way of composing. And for me, that's essential, you know, to go as close as I can to bring out, you know, who they are and what that culture is like. And I guess I just, in the beginning, I was, as I said, was kind of bored with how the sort of formulaic way that I thought images were being made.
Yeah. Well, part of that, of course, emerges from the way that you work with people and the fact that you don't make images in a traditional sense that we often talk about art making, that there is an artist, a solitary figure producing something purely from imagination. Of course, most of what you do emerges from collaboration, and many of the images that are in your books are images made by other people, by the people. And we've received a question about that, and about, in particular, about how you have established trust when you work with communities and individuals. The questioner wants to know if you can comment on how that process of working together initiates and then how it unfolds as you work in a community.
Yeah, a lot of times I work, all the time, I guess I work with institutions in that community. Like in India, I worked with the Self-Employed Women's Association, which was a very important organization, of union, really a union of home-based workers. And so, I think so how I go in is a large part of it. And in that case, we went through all these protocols, which I didn't come up with. We had a meeting where all the parents came and, talked about the project. And then another meeting where they wanted us we have to choose the kids. How do you choose the kids? And there were, the day that the kids were going to sign up, there were way too many kids. They were out into the road, and so I didn't do this, but they helped me construct a questionnaire. Sort of was like, what can you see when you look through the camera? What do you want to photograph? Very basic things, and then made a list of the kids based on cast, and and of course, if somebody really wanted to be in, we let them come in. But so it's like listening and asking, and then eventually, once we started working, they were totally a part of it. But also you have to bring the families along too. And I remember we had one girl who was an untouchable or Herigen. And one of the first things I did was to make portraits of them with Polaroid positive negative film, because they didn't really know what photographs were. That technology had bypassed the village. They saw videos, but they didn't have any photographs. And so anyway, her father, she brought her picture home that I had taken, and it was towards the end of the day, and so her skin was darker than it really was, and he was very upset about that. And so he came and said, well, he was worried that I was going to use this to influence the kids towards Christianity. So there's a lot of things that happen, and you have to work with an institution that's really respected and that you respect, and finding those places is not always that easy. Or sometimes they're not as trustworthy as maybe you thought, but rarely.
Right. I want to add to this that if you're curious, if anybody watching this is curious about Wendy's thinking around collaboration, she's actually one of the creators of a project that we showed at the Ryerson Image Center in 2018 called Collaboration: A Potential History of Photography, which essentially remapped how we look at and think about photography, not as a series of individual expressions, but rather as a series of interactions. You did that project with Ariel Azule, Susan Mysalis,
Laura Wexler, and Lee Rayford.
Eric Gottesman, who you mentioned before, is part of it sometimes, it's an ongoing thing. I believe that there's a book being published about it, and there have been some
Yep.
as well.
Yep. Yep. 2022.
And that will dig further into the many, many amazing and interesting ways that that collaboration has come to be understood better by practitioners primarily, but also by scholars. One thing that we've been asked in a question, and I think it's really interesting for thinking about how you collaborate. Of course, the means of interacting has changed over time. You know, when you started, you were working predominantly with Instamatic cameras.
Yep.
You know, that great photo of the wonderful flash bar on top of an
Right.
You've done a lot of work with Polaroids, which of course have the virtue of instantaneity. But I want to convey this question that one of our listeners has asked about whether you've moved into digital and whether that impacted your practice at all.
Yeah. That was very hard for me because the way that I was working was that the kids were developing and printing their pictures, and that whole process, you know, for one, slowed it down, and two, I could really explain to them, you know, how that could come to be, whereas I couldn't do it satisfactorily to my satisfaction with digital photography. And so it was really kind of a crisis. And it wasn't until I did a project in Israel over 2 years, Israel and the West Bank, where I worked with 14 different communities. And that was a massive project, but something I could never have done without digital. And I had to sort of rethink the way that I taught, or that I curated, you know, everything really. And then eventually, you know, realized that this was something I could do, but and I would like to do it again on that scale, because you can map a whole country that way rather than a village.
Just to ask a follow-up that came from another attendee, but it's quite related. Now, of course, so many people have cell phones and have this you know, ability to take images immediately and share them. Have you found that has actually made it harder for you to work with your students to convey the special capability, the special power that they have when making pictures? Or are they so used to the photographic expression now by the time you get to them that it's not as easy for them to think about it that way?
Yeah, I do think that's true. But on the other hand, when we work together, you know, in a group and we have a project, it's a different experience. I mean, they're all pretty much all using, you know, I bring the cameras, they're all using the same cameras, and we're looking at pictures, and, you know, it's more like, as someone once said, it's more like a graduate seminar, you know, being able to look at them and thinking, well, what are you trying to do? How, you know, how can we make this better? So there's a deepness to the experience, I think, that, or it's just a different experience than doing it to share, you know, with your friends.
Right.
And also making a final product too.
Right. One of our attendees has asked you a very specific question about literacy through photography, and in particular in Durham. Is it still going? It's still active? And if so, are you still involved?
I'm not still involved, and I don't know how, so I don't really know. Yeah.
But it's possible. I mean, it was certainly meant to outlast the
Yes. Yes. Yeah. No. And at one point we were working in 17 schools at one time, and it was quite a big project. And then slowly it you know,
right.
it sort of dwindled. it was very interesting because it really affected the school, the whole system, the whole Durham system. There were so many schools that were involved.
Yeah, yeah. We've received a question that I think is really interesting with your work, because you work with so many makers. How do you deal with the question of creative control and licensing of the images? Do you possess the copyright? Do you share the copyright with the young people and the families that make the images? How does that work?
Well, what I do is to work with the institution that I, go in with, as long as I, keeping these things up is sometimes a little bit difficult, but for example, in the white girls alphabet, that they decided they wanted the money from the sales. I mean, it's split, like if it's a gallery, the gallery gets some, I get some, and then the institution gets some, and then the institution can, decide, how it wants to share or use that money for other work. I mean, Apple Shop, they are using it to archive the material in their community. So it's that's generally what happens.
We've actually reached pretty near the end of our time, but we've got so many great questions that I want to ask just a couple more. One of the questions we received, really fascinating, asks if you can talk a little bit more about how you work specifically with your collaborators when discussing what they can reveal with their images. And I know that can sometimes be quite startling for you, what it is that that people express through their pictures. And sometimes it can be quite startling for their peers who are taking the workshop with them, or the communities that maybe don't want them revealing too much about their home lives, or about what's difficult, or what it is that scares them. I think it's particularly true given how openly you deal with and encourage your students to work with their dreams. So how do you talk to people about that when you're working with them, and how free do they feel in general?
Well, yeah, for example, I mean, when I started doing the dreams, for example, we would get in the dark room and turn out the lights, and I would start by describing, a dream that I had, and then we would sort of go around, and because, it can be uncomfortable to start that. Whereas in some cultures, like in Chiapas, in Mexico, in the Mayan tradition, dreams are extremely important. And all I had to say was fantasies or sueños, and that's something we were going to think about. And then the next day, they came with props that they had made from whatever that they had. So, the idea of being worried about that, or censoring that, was, not something that I thought about. I was just, I was following it. Whereas in South Africa, there were some, the African kids, for them, like the kids in Soweto, they didn't want to do that, because when they said, well, when we think about dreams, when we think about dreams, we think about, I think about my mother not coming home at night and being under bloodied newspapers, from the travel in the buses. So one has to be careful in certain situations and thinking about what all that means. And then I have had situations in schools where they have taken pictures that have been, you know, physically revealing, and you know, and then there are protocols, but there are protocols within the school that they know me, you know, I know them, you know, it's not just like turning somebody in. But yeah, it can be sensitive, but I think negotiable. But I think it is difficult for some people. But I think about it from, try to think about it from the student or the child's perspective, as well as the safety of everybody included.
Great. So I'm going to end on a two-part question from someone who is attending from India. A big fan of your work, by the way. And the first question is, for children who have never used a camera before, which I think represents in your career, it's a significant number of the people you worked with. Do you find it a challenge to strike a balance between teaching them the basics, the technology, the tools, the materials, techniques, versus retaining the freshness of their vision? Or do you find that that's very natural for them to negotiate that?
Well, I think it's something that I am very concerned with, that they should be able to use it as well as possible. And because I think it's easy to just say, okay, there's a naive vision, let them go. Whereas they don't really understand how to use the tools, and they can learn to use the tools. I mean, the kids in Chiapas, some of them could hardly use the Polaroid camera. I mean, the span of their fingers was difficult. And also they had to measure the distance between themselves and the subject, because it was a manual thing of how many meters. And but we figured out ways to do that, and they made suggestions. Like the kids in Chiapas were going out to photograph, and I was measuring their feet to a meter so that they could, you know, measure it that way. But the kids in Chamula said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to cut cane stalks to meter lengths, and so we can take the cane stalk out with us. And also they were carrying sodium sulfite to put the negatives in, because it was, you know, so, you know, people can do things, and they were so focused on doing it well. And, you know, I think maybe sometimes the harder it is, not that you want to make it harder, but, you know, the more you have to focus on the tools, you understand and feel how important it is. And then it slows down your vision too. You can think more about what it is you're doing.
It's interesting. The second part of the question is a bit more lighthearted. It's just about a letter that appears in the section of Secret Games about India. There's a letter from one of the kids asking if you will visit again. And of course, many, many times you have visited again, but were you able to visit that child again, or that village?
No, I haven't. But I am in communication with some people there, and I really want to do it. So, and also the woman who was my assistant then is now a TV presenter. And so she and I are in touch and talk about going back, and also one of the kids also talked about making a contemporary version. So.
Wow. Wonderful. Well, something to look forward to.
Yes.
Wendy, thank you so much. Thanks for being
here. Thank you, Paul.
And thanks for doing this Zoom in the middle of the gallery. It really is. It's not a backdrop. That's really it.
Yes, it is. So come see it if you can.
And in fact, just to remind everybody, the exhibition is called "The Pictures Woke the People Up: Canada, Colombia, and American Alphabets." And the show opens tomorrow. So anyone that wants to see it, you can go out tomorrow. I think it's open in the afternoon.
Yep.
And
From 11 to 5, I think.
and Wendy will be there. And with that, I want to thank everyone who attended, especially the people who asked such wonderful questions. Thank you for being with us, and good night.
Thank you.